don't know about that. Okay, sorry about that. I just had a recording incident on the computer. No, the Federal Reserve notes, once they're made legal tender, everybody conducts their business in Federal Reserve notes. So what are the consequences of that? Well, there are huge consequences to the states who, by allowing the Congress to introduce Federal Reserve notes and allowing them to be declared as legal tender, has allowed the whole country's population to abandon actual money and to do business, all their business, and earn all of their earnings in Federal Reserve notes. Now, Title 31, Section 3124, says obligations of the United States are exempt from taxation by a state. So the states have no legal constitutional right to tax any of the monies earned by the citizens, because the states have allowed Federal Reserve notes to take the place of legal tendered dollars. And the states are prohibited from taxing obligations of the United States, which the Federal Reserve notes are specifically declared to be, again, in Section 12, Title 12, Section 411. Federal Reserve notes are obligations of the United States. 31, Title 31, Section 5103, Federal Reserve notes are legal tender. That's unconstitutional, but they've gotten away with it. Title 31, Section 3124, obligations of the United States are exempt from taxation by a state. Now, it's also interesting that at Title 12, Section 531, the whole Federal Reserve Bank itself is made exempt from taxation. They've never been audited. They've never paid a dime in tax. We owe them $35 trillion that they've earned across 115 years. Allegedly, they've earned it, right? Yeah, check. They kited the whole system. The whole thing is fraud. And $35 trillion, they've never paid a dime in tax. How about that? What do you think? You think we have a tax system, or do we have a system of peonage, where you've been thrown into the involuntary servitude, the $35 trillion debt owed to the Federal Reserve Bank by the idiots in Congress? That's right. None of the money goes in the Treasury. It all goes to the Federal Reserve Bank. It's not a system of taxation. It's a system of peonage. And the states have lost their ability to be viable economic entities because they're prohibited from taxing the medium of exchange that all the earnings are earned in today. Now, of course, the states ignore this and just violate the law and let the states do it because, my God, if we ever obeyed the law, every single state would fail almost immediately, because they've stupidly allowed Congress to give away the money supply. And this all happened, of course, approximately at the same time, because it was the 16th Amendment that put in place the income tax, and it's the 17th Amendment that replaced the senator's appointment by the state legislatures with a popular vote by the people. So the states have lost their representation within the system. It was initially a three-way system. You had the federal government under the executive, you had the Senate being appointed by the state legislatures, and the House of Representatives being elected by we the people across the country every 2 years. And the states had their representation in the Senate, the people had their representation in the House, and the federal government had its authority to execute the law under the executive branch of the government. And the judicial was supposed to be an impartial body that kept everybody in line by applying the law equally to all parties. And of course, the judiciary has been invaded and subverted with socialist perversion, because the socialists took aim at our educational systems. They took aim at the colleges, and they took aim at the law schools, and they invaded them and perverted them and began teaching nonsensical idiocy, lunacy. Things like the 16th Amendment is a direct tax without apportionment. Oh, show me the word direct in the amendment. Can't do it because you're lying. It's not direct. That's judicial legislation. That's judicial legislation of the highest order, sedition. It's perversion and subversion of the Constitution. Adding the word direct by interpretation to engineer an unlimited power to tax directly and without limitation in violation of the Article 1 provisions in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, prohibiting direct taxation unless laid in proportion to the census and apportioned to the states for collection. Oh, but no, that's all gone. The 16th Amendment put in place the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. The power to tax non-uniformly, graduated and directly, every single thing you do, even though there's no territorial or constitutional authority to touch that subject area. Like labor. The whole system is a fraud, people. You've been enslaved to a philosophy, to a bank that is running the country in place of the government. Take a look at it, right? Who's running the country? Is it Powell or Biden? Powell's the one sitting on the interest rates. He needs to lower interest rates so that Main Street America can get access to capital again, but he's not doing it, is it? Can Biden do anything about it? No, because he's a dementia-ridden puppet. He can't even read the words on the teleprompter anymore. He gets lost standing in a crowd on stage. Oh, where am I? Where am I? Oh, that's nice. Where do I go now? Somebody, where do I go? Oh, salute. Salute who? The ghost? The invisible people? What do I do? Run out the back door and shut the door so my bald little head is the only thing the American people ever actually see? This guy is running for president. When does he talk? When does he ever talk to the American people? Any press conferences? Any ad hoc questions? This guy is a scripted marionette. He's run by strings. They pull the strings and he dances. Well, he doesn't dance anymore, right? He falls over when they pull the strings, so they can't pull them very hard anymore. Or his pants will fall off. And everybody will see what's really going on. Somebody help us. And of course, the Democratic plan is to steal America, right? That's why they've brought all these illegal aliens in, to register them to vote so that they don't lose electoral votes or seats in Congress. Okay, I think I hear the next break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back in 5, and guess I better figure out what happened with the machine here. Okay, we'll be back in 5. Stay tuned. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and we're just going to go ahead and get right into the last segment of the show here. As I was saying, there are consequences to allowing the Federal Reserve Bank to issue and take over and monopolize the currency with Federal Reserve notes, which are obligations to the United States and which obligations are not taxable to the states. So the states have just been violating the federal law, and they've been getting away with it because everybody knows the whole system will collapse if the law ever gets enforced. But it's right there in the statutes. And I'd like to point out that there's another consequence to the states that none of them are aware of. And I'm going to put all of this in a separate video that I'll post on the Tax Freedom YouTube channel, which explains these, and I'm going to show you the statutes the way I do with off the Cornell Law Library online website. The statutes that I've been referencing are Title 12, Section 411, Federal Reserve Notes or Obligations of the U.S., Title 31, Section 5103, Federal Reserve Notes or Legal Tender, Title 31, Section 3124, Obligations of the U.S. are exempt from taxation by a state, and Title 12, Section 531, the Federal Reserve Bank itself is exempt from all taxation and auditing. So you've been taken over and being run. The Federal Reserve Bank is the master running the country. Joe Biden is the puppet dancing on the strings. And the states, because of allowing the Congress to sell out to the Federal Reserve Bank and give the Federal Reserve Bank the monopoly on currency and credit, the states have threatened the viability of their own existence because they can no longer raise tax revenues because all business and all earnings are conducted in Federal Reserve notes, which are exempt from state taxation as obligations of the United States, because they're evidence of debt, not evidence of value or inherent asset, which is what the dollar was, this gold and silver coin. There's inherent value in the dollar. It's not evidence of debt, it's evidence of real asset. And that was the point. Money needs to be an asset, not a debt. But the states, by allowing this to happen, have deprived themselves of the legal ability to raise revenue to fund the states. All it is a matter of one federal judge telling them, sorry, he's right, you're wrong. There's the law, you never should have let them do it. But you lost your representation in the Senate when it turned into a popular election. So now the states are at the mercy of the federal government, the same way the people are, or rather at the mercy of the stupidity of Congress, because that's what happened, isn't it? They're the ones that sold out to the bankers, and it's made them wealthy. And things went okay in America for a while, but the worm has turned, and the numbers are now becoming so large at 35 trillion, and the debt burden so large that the American people are going to feel the pain for the next few years, or very soon thereafter, if Donald Trump manages to somehow alleviate and avoid the coming catastrophe by bringing back down the price of oil, diesel, gasoline, and energy, which would take the pressure off the price increases and might make it possible for things to limp along for a little while longer until the next huge banking crisis hits, which I think is going to come out of commercial real estate the same way that the subprime loans in residential real estate collapsed everything in 2008. And they've been printing money like crazy ever since, and keeping interest rates as low as possible to try to keep the system afloat and people's head above water. And what's happened, of course, is that's come unglued. With the 17 trillion they added to the M1 money supply as a result of COVID, they spurred an inflation run that was triggered by energy prices, but now is being perpetuated by monetary policy and excessive spending by the government, which refuses to recognize it's the problem and insists on continuously exacerbating the problem by spending more and giving more away and committing more and more to the printing of trillions more in currency to be borrowed. And the states are additionally in trouble because I've looked at a lot of state codes, and almost every single one of the codes for the state tax laws for income tax hinges the state tax on the definition of gross income in the federal law. And as I've shown you before, Section 61 in the federal law gross income originated not in 1913, but 5 years later in 1918 under a different piece of original legislation. And it didn't originate as Section 61, it originated as Section 22A. And it applied to the original legislation it was enacted under, which was a 75-year-long Canadian tax treaty. And that tax treaty expired in 1993 when it was replaced by Bill Clinton with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which means we no longer have any taxation, which means the Canadian tax treaty, the 75-year-long treaty signed in 1918, is dead letter law, which means Section 61 is dead letter law. It may be on the books, but it has no published applicability that Congress ever enacted for it beyond its original enactment in 1918 as part of the Canadian tax treaty. It has been part of the huge monumental fraud perpetrated on the American people by the government and the courts specifically. Section 61 was never domestic law. They never had authority to tax your rent, your interest, your dividends, or your compensation. Only those sources were earned by the corporate person, where everything earned by the corporate person is subject to the excise on the privilege of incorporation. But individuals aren't subject to tax on those sources unless they're earned in Canada under the tax treaty between 1918 and 1993. And that isn't ever going to happen again, is it? So Section 61 is dead letter law. It does not implement a direct tax on everything the American people do. It simply doesn't do that. It was never enacted by Congress with that applicability. It was part of the Canadian tax treaty, and every single state has hinged their tax law on that piece of code. So there is no gross income in America anymore, earned by anyone. The statute is dead letter law. It expired in 1993, and Congress never enacted it with any greater applicability. It simply hasn't been done. It's part of the monumental fraud that turns the indirect tax, which income is a function of, where income is not the object of the tax or the subject of taxation. Income is the yardstick that measures the amount of tax owed on the earnings derived from the federally taxable activity that was conducted, being subject to some impost, duty, or excise tax. Imposts taxing foreign persons, foreign activity, and foreign imports, and activities in foreign places like territories and possessions. Duties being taxes on exported goods, and excises being taxes on commodities, licenses, and corporations. None of which, impost, duty, or excise, none of which touches the labor of the American people in the 50 states. Only in the territories and possessions, and only the labor of non-resident alien persons in America. That's Section 1441 if you want to go check the statute. So it was a foreign tax. The Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913 is the original piece of legislation. That's a foreign tax, and tariff is one form of an impost, the authority to tax foreign persons by withholding, and in foreign places like the territories and possessions. And we see all of this faithfully recorded in the statute to the 1939 statutes at large under Section 4. We see it 26 years later, how the tax is applied under law. And it all got messed up because of the victory tax in 42, which was a 2-year temporary war revenue measure, which wasn't really phrased as an income tax, it was phrased as the victory tax. But it taxed the labor of the American people to fund the war. It was totally unconstitutional, but nobody objected. And when it expired at the end of 1944, Congress decided they couldn't let that power to tax labor directly, which no one had objected to, they didn't want to let it expire. So they enacted a new tax law that set up the current tax withholding system by allowance. And then they indoctrinated the American people to believe that they had to allow the collection of the tax, even when there was no tax that would be owed at the end of the year. For example, when you're 15 years old and you write single and zero on your W-4 at McDonald's, but you're only going to work part-time 1,000 hours. You're only going to make minimum wage $10 an hour. So all year long, you're only going to make $10,000. But the filing threshold is $13,850. So you don't even have to file a tax return. And there's no tax owed on any of those earnings. So why did they take 3,000 of the 10? Why did they withhold $3,000? Because you wrote single and zero. That triggered a 30% rate. But why would you hold 30% from someone who doesn't owe any tax? It's because they're not collecting tax. They're training you to give up your constitutional rights by filing a return. Not to pay tax, but to get a refund for the first 8 years of your working life from age 15 to age 23. You get it all back. But at age 24 or so, suddenly the bottom line says you owe, but you've been trained. So you fill out the form and send them the money and spend the rest of your life as a working slave, as a peon to the Federal Reserve Bank, because none of the money you send in goes in the Treasury. It all goes right to the Federal Reserve Bank. Check the back of the last check you sent to them. See what it says. See if it says deposit to the U.S. Treasury is required by law under Section 7809, or see if it doesn't say pay to any FRB, Federal Reserve Bank. Why is a private corporation cashing your tax check? Where's that in the Constitution? Where's that in the law? What's in the law is every penny collected for tax has to be deposited in the U.S. Treasury on a daily basis. Now, regulations modify that daily basis to a regular cycle of weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly, and most employers send in their withheld taxes on a quarterly basis. But how come on January 10th, not one penny of tax is recorded as having been paid under your name and account number is required by Section 7809 for all deposits of tax sent in by your employer? Well, it's because none of the money went in the Treasury. And what happens when you file on April 15th is you're given a credit for tax for all the peonage debt service you voluntarily allowed to be taken out of your paycheck all year long so the Federal Reserve Bank could run the country in place of the government and run out the currency to run up the debt, to enslave the people to the bank through the requirement to service the interest, or to give up political and legal control of your own country in order to win concessions and debt forgiveness from the private bank. Is that what's really going on? Because it can never be repaid. And the bankers don't want it to be repaid because then there would be no medium of exchange and circulation. It's a matter of political and legal leverage to win control, not just of the country, but of the planet, by controlling the currency that the planet uses, or destroying the currency that the planet won't use. And this is what the banking cabal is working to effect all the time. This is what the World Economic Forum is doing. This is what the World Health Organization is doing. This is what the World Bank is doing. This is what the UN is doing. They're working to effect a global government of control of all natural resources and enslave the people of every country, not just the Chinese and the North Koreans and the other socialist, communist nations around the country, which only find out afterwards that socialism is a fraud that destroys. It doesn't assist or free, or it just destroys. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Looks like we're coming up on the end of the show. I'm going to put that video out on the states and the Federal Reserve notes in Section 61, so watch for that on the Thomas Freed channel. We'll be back next week with more.